So I'm standing between you and a break, which is always quite a big challenge. And I've also noticed that I have an older brother called John and an older brother called Julian, and I'm coming up after John and Julian, so it's slightly strange. But the question I have in my mind is I'm trying to work out what your energy levels are. And I'm wondering whether I should make you do an energizer. Yes. Okay, right, okay, we're going to do one. Okay, so I have a bunch of slides. I'll go through those in a minute. But first we're going to do an energizer. And an energizer is a way of getting people's energy back up. So how's this going to happen? I was walking down the street one day when? Okay? So I'm going to start the story, and I want you to throw me random things for me to continue the story. So random words, like banana and elephant and automobile or whatever it is, okay? So I'm going to start, and if you don't, so here's your big warning. If you don't throw any words at me, I'm going to start picking on people, okay? So, I was walking down the street one day when? Shoes. When my shoes, actually, interestingly enough, the heel of my shoe started to come off because it wasn't attached properly and I hadn't worked out the proper IP around it. Another? And as my heel came off, I bumped into a tree which was right beside the pavement where I was walking along and banged my head. And as I did that, I glanced up and noticed in the tree there was a squirrel with an iPad who was taking a picture of me. And? What? Neptune. And the squirrel, it turned out, because I conversed with him, it turned out his name was Neptune. And Neptune was doing a study on people and heels and where IP sat in heels. Okay, so that's the game. Now what I'm going to ask you to do is get into pairs or threes. And I want you to do the same thing. One of you is going to start the story, and you're going to do it in pairs or threes or wherever you want to be. And you're going to talk to each other. This might be slightly alien. You're going to talk to each other, and I want you to start with one of you telling the story and the other's throwing in the random words. Okay? So you're each going to start in your pairs. I was walking down the street one day when. And then just the other person throw in random, here's the big clue, random words. So get going. Okay, we'll stop there. You've had a little bit of an energizer. Any quick feedback? How did that feel? Funny. What did you find difficult? Okay, first problem, trying to speak in English. Any other things? Okay. Anyone else? Any other reflections? One of the interesting things about that energizer is actually what people find really hard. They think they panic and they go, oh my God, I have to tell a story, this is going to be really hard. And what they find actually is the storytelling is really easy. And what they find really hard is coming up with random words. So in fact, it kind of flips around. And what's interesting about that is innovation is a story of, see what I did there? I brought it all together. Innovation is about storytelling. It's about telling stories about things that you see around you, about maybe some of the big data you have or some of the personal experiences you have. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk you through some of my experiences working with large organizations who are trying to be like startups, but not. And in France, I work with Pernod Ricard in their Kangaroo Fund, which is their Disruptive Innovation Fund. I work with Castrol and Philips and various other people. So let me tell you a bit about what I've learned on that journey. So Picasso, hackers on the wrong way. Everyone's pretty hacked off with the hackers, or as John mentioned earlier on, they're not really hackers, they're entrepreneurs. And everyone finds them threatening and enticing at the same time. So the question is, what can you do about that? I think the first thing is everyone starts to go, wow, what we should do is we should disrupt. The world's full of disruption. We need to find ways of disrupting our industry. And that's great, but disruption is a box. And when you open the box, as we say in English, it does what it says on the tin. So when you open up the disruption box, what it has inside it is disruption of the market you're in, disruption of your competitors, but perversely, disruption of the way you work, disruption of the experiences you have, disruption of careers of people in the organization you're in. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. And one of the things we see in large organizations is they kind of go down this route of let's disrupt. And I think this is a typical Anglo-Saxon presentation style. We have a joke somewhere early on. And one of the big problems in disruption is there's a lot of false positives. And I don't know if you know false positives. False positives essentially are like if you do some sort of medical test and it turns out you've got whatever the illness is and it turns out actually you don't really have it. you have something else. And large organizations tend to go, oh my God, we've got to disrupt, we've got to do digital, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, and they run down this pathway. And in fact, sometimes you don't need it. So why bother disrupting? So what do we mean by disrupt? And when I talk with Pernod Ricard, whoever, we talk about disruption. There's kind of an easy definition. For us, it's a better answer for a consumer challenge. And here you have the original light bulbs, and then you had Philips invented the LED light bulbs. And it's a better answer than what you already have. So somehow you've got to change something about your world. The problem for Philips is they've invented such a good light bulb that it lasts for a lifetime now. So actually they've kind of killed their own business off. That's what disruption is. It's having a better answer to an existing problem. And how does that happen? Well, industries tend to like to think of themselves as kind of nice little silos. I'm in the telco industry, or I'm in the pharmaceutical industry, or I'm in the wellness industry. And in reality, you aren't really in those industries. You're kind of looking at your lens and trying to work out where you sit. And you look at people around you and go, yeah, they're in the same sort of industry as I am. And you kind of see that as your world. But actually, you're in a system. You're in a large business system which has lots of moving parts. And the problem for large organizations is they don't see those moving parts. So if you think of a luxury handbag, the luxury handbag comes from a cow somewhere. The leather comes from a cow. That cow sits in an ecosystem of cash agriculture. How can I make the most money out of the crops I'm growing? It sits in an ecosystem of government legislation in the US saying we should support ethanol, so the governments give huge subsidies to companies supporting ethanol. And right down at the other end, there's the consumer going, well, do I need a luxury handbag? What are my choices? Do I want a luxury handbag? Do I want a holiday in the Bahamas? And their ecosystem, their choices are much broader than I need a handbag, I'm going to get it now. So here's a pop question for you. When BMW built the new Mini and they started to sell it, they wanted to work out what was the biggest competitor to the new Mini. Any guesses what it was? You know this is a trick question, so... What? Good, cool, that's a good guess. A facelift and a boot job. In fact, what BMW found was their biggest competitor to the Mini was a second kitchen. And what was happening was the car was being bought by the second car in a family, and it was generally a woman's car, and they were thinking, do I do up the kitchen or do I have a new car? And that was their ecosystem. It wasn't, then they were like, we've got to compete against the Yaris and the Fiat 500s and whatever. In fact, it was all about how they positioned against a kitchen. And then that changed their advertising and so on and so forth. So one of the things that large companies fail to do is they fail to look at the system in which they're in. They kind of focus on an industry. And that means that you don't see the things that happen, the changes that happen. So we've talked about entrepreneurs and hackers and whatever, and there's lots of stuff about startups, which is the same sort of space. Clayton Christian talked about this, and he talked about disruptive innovation, and he said, if you're an incumbent and you're innovating around what you know how to do, you will almost always win. If you're trying to come up with some completely new and disruptive, you will almost always lose. And if I go back to the systems problem, the reason for that is a large organization. What is a large organization? It's a great way of making money for its shareholders and being successful in the business world. And what it does is it works out the answer to the problem of how do I make money, and then it makes it better. It puts in Six Sigma, and it puts in re-engineering and delayering or whatever, and it makes that system sing, and it makes it work really well. The problem is the disruption isn't in the same operating model as you are. It's in a completely different world. And what a startup has, and John talked a bit about the differences between entrepreneurs and large companies. What a startup has, it has no operating model. All it has, ideally, is a really good bit of consumer insight. And it's going, and a startup, as a definition, is a business in search of an operating model. It's trying to work out how it can make money. And its purpose is to keep playing around with what its offer is and how it's positioned until it lands on that answer. And startups make money when they figured out that question. That's when they become successful. So Salesforce.com, launched in 1998 or whatever, was trying to figure out what the service as a software model was. Today, it's a $6 billion company and is constantly voted as one of the best companies in the world. They worked out their operating model. And John earlier on talked about the culture around that. Well, there's a bit of a challenge around when you sit in that operating model, it's very difficult to see elsewhere. So, yeah, this is obviously another trick question. Which of these lines is bigger? Top or bottom? Neither. They're the same size, right? No, they're not actually. The top one's actually longer. What you are in is what, and there are two things I'll talk about around innovation, all the stuff we do. Two things I think you should take away. One is a concept called rivers of thinking. And rivers of thinking was a term coined by Edward de Bono. And his point about the way we think is, if you imagine a rain cloud falling on a hill, the first drops kind of go down the hill and find their way. And as it starts to rain more, that starts to turn into streams and rivers. And eventually you have big rivers of thinking coming down that mountain. And people, when you first see a piece of data and you don't know what it is, you kind of, where does it fit? But the more you're an expert, the more you know about the world you're in, the quicker you go, it's all about that. And I know what the answer is. And you answer it really quickly. Now, on the visual thing I just did, you went into a river of thinking, which he's doing one of those visual test things, and he's going to make me say one of them smaller. But the answer is, I got you in a river of thinking. You were thinking it's a visual test, and therefore I know, despite what I'm seeing, and the top one was actually 10% longer than the bottom one, I'm going to give a different answer. And large businesses do that, and that's the challenge of a large business, is it gets so good at answering the questions. Every time it sees something, it goes, that's just like this. It's just like something I know how to do. And as you get better and better at your business, that river gets faster and deeper, and it's more difficult to get out of. And if you're kind of the guy in the business and you're shooting down that river and you see something on the side of the river, and you think, wait, what was that over there? Before you know it, you've gone past it, you're shouting out to your colleagues in the business, and they're going, I didn't see anything, what are you talking about? That could never have existed. And that's a key concept around innovation, is people live in rivers of thinking. Now, rivers of thinking are a great thing because they allow you to get up in the morning and decide fairly quickly how you're going to get to work, what shoes you're going to wear, how you're going to put your socks on. But when it gets into a world that's shifting and moving, you get stuck in a pattern of behavior, and you repeat that pattern of behavior over and over again. And the second big concept is something that Steve Johnson, who's a science writer, talks about, and he calls it slow hunching. And slow hunching is innovation which isn't all about the I've got it moment. Slow hunching is, there's something going on there, I need to figure it out, but I don't know what the answer is, and I need to think on this. Now, large organizations typically don't like slow hunching. You don't know what's going on, you've got a budget, you've got deadlines, you've got milestones. But great ideas evolve over months, years, decades. Charles Darwin, here, he thought he had an aha moment when he read Malthus's theory of population and overpopulation of the planet. And that's when he said, all this stuff I've been looking at around evolution, it's all about. But in fact, a recent biography of Charles Darwin looked at his notes, and 2 or 3 years earlier on, he was already exploring this idea of the evolution of animals and this idea of survival of the fittest. And the one piece he was missing was, what's the mechanism that allows that to happen, the whole genetic reproduction. But it took him a period of 3 or 4 years to actually work out the answer. And we love these stories where you suddenly come up with it and boom, you figured out the answer to your innovation challenge. And you do a workshop and you all sit there for a day and you come up with lots of Post-its and you group them. And everyone goes, wow, that was amazing. In reality, the best ideas take much longer than that, and they need to evolve. So one of the innovations, I mentioned I was working with Castrol, which isn't a luxury goods company. We did some work with them, and they came up with an innovation in a workshop in Singapore, and it evolved over 18 months. It took 18 months to work out what it was, what the thing they had was. And it turned into this kind of quite complex thing. And when they stopped and looked at it and ran the numbers on it, they found out that it was probably worth 5 times the entire size of Castrol. But if they'd put it in the normal innovation process, they would have turned it into something really tiny and really simple and really straightforward. So 2 big things, I think, to think about when you're in this kind of space of how do we disrupt, how do we think about innovation. The first is think about what your rivers of thinking are, and businesses are in an operating model river of thinking. And if your whole industry is doing the same thing the same way, everybody is telling you this is the way the world works. And you're the one guy going, or the one girl going, I don't think it works like that. It kind of seems to work somewhere else. And there was a fairly well-known professor from Stanford, and I say fairly well-known because I can't remember his name, who said, it's not what you don't know that's going to kill you, it's what you know that isn't so. Okay, so you process that one for a moment. It's the things that you believe and you're certain about to be true that turn out not to be true that are going to kill you, and that sits in your operating model. So startups versus large organizations. We talked about disruption. How does it play out? What we see, and some of the challenges for large organizations is, because you're in a kind of river of thinking about this is how we make money, what you do is you invent more products or you invent more services. These are the guys from Innocent. What a startup is doing is going, I need to invent a whole business. And you're going, how is this business going to work? I've got a product, but what's the business that makes it work? So you're exploring a much bigger terrain with many more moving parts. And large organizations get stuck in this, I need a new product, I need a new product, I need a new service. The second point, which I think was raised by Julia and John, was this notion of risk management or just doing it. In large organizations, it's risky. You're going to do something new, and wow, let's do the analysis, and let's do a risk mitigation strategy, and let's run the numbers. And it always looks kind of risky when it's a bit different. And why does it look risky? It looks risky for a number of reasons. One, because you're not actually discounting in or factoring in the risk of doing nothing at all, which is probably the biggest risk you actually have. And secondly, the perverse nature of risk analysis in large organizations is generally, well, if we've already got the sales force and we've already got the manufacturing and blah, then we don't put it in our investment case. You want to start out something new, you've got to put it all in. So they're kind of disadvantaged. What startups do is they just go and do it. As I think John mentioned, there is no risk. You're just going to go and do something, you're going to find out. Another thing we see a lot in large organizations is large organizations manage projects. They manage lots of projects with lots of milestones, and they report up and they show how they're doing against milestones, and they have little booze charts and red, yellow, and green indicators. And they manage to them, and they worry about how they're performing against the milestones. What startups do is they have people who are passionate about what they're trying to do. And I think John mentioned this earlier on, about belief. And this is James Avadik, who you might know. You might know the product Goo. It came to France. It's a luxury chocolate product. And he just believed in it. He was a margarine salesman in Belgium, so trying to sell margarine from Unilever to the Belgians, and not going very well, and he had this idea about chocolate. And he thought there was a market for a high-end chocolate product, and actually it was a chocolate product he ended up designing, which is twice the price of everything else in that chocolate space. And his big insight was about the quality and about having he worked out what his consumer was, and he said, what I want a consumer who is going to put this on their dinner table, a rich host at a dinner party who will be willing to put this on the table and say it's their, lie about their product and put it because it's that good. And the way James went about this, because we've worked quite a lot with James and other stuff, what he did was, and this was the kind of just doing it bit, he got a package of Goo, and he kind of went, well, where's my ideal client in the UK? And he got his map out of the UK, and he figured out that it was actually, there was a 1 square mile of Fulham in London where all the richest people lived. And he got his packaging, and he put some blue tack in it to make it heavy, because weight is an indicator of quality. And he went into the Waitrose, which was the more up-end supermarkets in Fulham, and he shoved it on a shelf, and he hid around the corner. And he waited to see what happened. And in his head, he was like, well, if no one does anything in 5 minutes, it's back to selling margarine to the Belgians. But if someone takes it off in the next 5 minutes, I've got something to get going with. And sure enough, in about a minute and a half, someone pulled it off the shelf. A housewife looked at it, took it down, felt the weight, and put it in her basket. And then he leapt out and explained he was doing this kind of weird study, and she was like, bloody marketeers and whatever. But he'd gone out and he'd tested his concept, and that was all about the passion and the belief he had around it. And the final big thing that startups have that large organizations don't, and this is, in some senses, maybe the most difficult challenge, is large organizations have a model of innovation, which is we start out here, and then we're going to kind of narrow down as we go forward. You're going to go to stage gate 1, and you're going to tell me the value. You're going to tell me stage gate 2, and you're going to tell me the investment. Stage gate 3, I need the product packaging. Stage gate 4, whatever I need. And you're kind of narrowing down on the answer. So if you're Pernod Ricard, typically that means if my starter idea is 40% alcohol in a bottle, well, it bloody well better be 40% alcohol in the bottle when I get to the end of this innovation process. Now, what startups do is they kind of go, wow, I've got this really good idea, let's do something. And then they go, wait a minute, I've just found out something really interesting about the market or the consumers, and I'm going to do something else. And they zag. And then they go, that's going pretty well, we'll do the next stage. And then they find out another bit of insight, and they zig again. And you end up with a situation where they're way out of their pipeline. A startup could start with, if you take the example of PayPal, PayPal started off as, we're going to be an internet security company. There's something about internet security that's going to be amazing, and we're going to try and make that work. And they kind of got going, and they invested in it, and they got some backing. And it didn't really click. And they're like, so this was their first zig. And they said, well, actually, tell you what would be really clever is, if there's all those newfangled things called Palm Pilots, and some of you may remember Palm Pilots, and they had this model where you could flip IOUs by Bluetooth from one Palm Pilot to another. So this is going to be really cool. People are going to love this. And at the same time, they put a website up where people could track their expenditure. And the Palm Pilot thing, they got 10,000 users, not getting a lot of interest. What they found out was there were 90,000 people on the website doing transactions on the website. And at that moment, they realized their model was all about internet payments, not about Palm Pilot payments. Now, in the world of a large organization, you're just not going to do that. You can't go, I'm going to make some 40% alcohol in a bottle, and at the end of it, I'm going to give you a website. They're going to go, what the hell? We signed up some agreements, we had some milestones, blah, 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 blah. That's why they win. They explore, they have passion, they think about businesses, not about products, and they don't worry about milestones. So that's 4-0. 4-0 to the startups, sort of Portugal versus Germany. How can big companies survive in that? Well, there's obviously a part which is, okay, how do you do that? And we've been working with Pernod Ricard on the Kangaroo Fund, which is a disruptive innovation fund, and we've been working with that. And I've been working with a friend who's an angel investor, so sort of pre-VC, who invests in startups and explores how they could evolve and then sells them on to VCs. And in that journey, what we discovered is actually large companies have an awful lot of really big, useful things. And I think John talked about some of this. One is, and he said this, he said he was in the meeting when we were doing kind of business model stuff and working out what the business models could be. And he said in the corner, this was my friend Greg, he said in the corner was a guy on Chatter. And he was posting what was going on. And at the same time, all these comments were coming back about what was going on and what they thought about it. And he was like, wow, that's a killer app for us. I'm tapping into the entire expertise of 16,000 people in Pernod Ricard who can help me explore my challenge. And the startup has none of that expertise. Big watch out for your river of thinking. Secondly, you generally have lots of money. So fairly obvious, lots of money to invest. One of the interesting things we found out in the Kangaroo Fund was we were kind of doing well, and the projects were evolving, and Pernod Ricard hit the Chinese problem where you weren't allowed to gift really expensive cognac to Chinese Communist Party officials. And their market bombed out, and they started to cut the budget. Now, one of the things we found out when you cut the budget of innovative ideas is it forces them to be more creative about what they do. So in fact, in a large company, the meaner you are with the money, the more creative the people get around how they're going to get around this problem. They get smarter around how they're going to explore the challenge, they get smarter around the sorts of tests they're going to do, and they do everything faster and quicker because they're in that startup world of the burn rate. So if you've got money, be mean with it. And finally, you've got customer relationships. I think as John mentioned, there are customers, as a large organization, you have hundreds and thousands of customers, so find ways to use them, but not abuse them. And generally, what we find is customers love being in that innovation space. They love kind of being the people who get to explore stuff. So in fact, it builds up your bank of credit. So our key learnings are there's a bunch of things that startups do really well, and you've got to think about how you do those. But you can always win. If you get that right, you can always win because you have a number of things that they can never access. And that was the big conversation we had with Alexandre Ricard a few months ago. So the challenge is, can you find a way of playing the startup game? That's your challenge, is how do I set up a startup in a large organization? And there's no magic answer to it. There's a bit about pushing the large organization. And I remember the discussions with Castrol when they set up their group called Castrol Interventures. and they were the CFO, and it was kind of this very enlightened leadership team. And the CFO was like, well, we need to give you some funding, and we're not really going to give you any targets, because we kind of know that innovation isn't necessarily all about targets in the first years. So he said, well, how much should I give you? And he kind of went, well, I'm not going to give you £1 billion, because that's an awful lot of money. He said, I'm not going to give you £10 million, because that doesn't feel enough. So he said, I'm going to give you £100 million for 5 years, and go off and find out what's going on. And that was a very enlightened leadership moment where they kind of said, we're going to ring fence that money and we're going to let you explore. And that's quite unusual, but that's kind of what you need to do. That's your bet on the future. That's your mitigating the risk that your existing business model is going to get totally screwed in 2, 3, 4 years down the line. I think, as John was mentioning, the cycle in which business models actually exist is getting shorter and shorter. So I've talked about it. A last couple of thoughts from the sort of what we think about innovation. One of the things that startups do really well and big companies generally fail at is startups always have an insight. They always have an insight about the consumer world. So large companies tend to have product strategies, and our top tip is look for great insight. And we have a thing called the clue wheel, which we use in What If. And the clue wheel is about the consumer. You can be about them, find out about them, you can be with them, or you can be them. You can be a consumer and have that experience. So I was talking to Lenovo recently. We were talking about the in-store experience. Neither of the people I'd spoken to had been into a Lenovo store in the last 5 years. And in the middle, you've got 3 types of consumers. You've got normal consumers, deep consumers, and weird consumers. And normals are your kind of like the people who kind of buy the stuff that you recognize. They might buy a luxury good every now and then or whatever. The deep people are the people who are kind of obsessed by your product, and they might have 10 watches. And when you speak to deep consumers, people who they're kind of obsessed with what you're selling, they have a much greater insight about what it is that makes your product work and why they love it. So they will give you insights that normal consumers won't. And then probably the most interesting is the weird part. Find weird consumers. And those are consumers who might be, I never buy luxury goods, I think they're a total waste of money. And you go and find out from them, well, what do they think about that? Why do they do that? And in those weird spaces, in the deep and the weird, is actually where, I've gone too far, you get the most interesting insights. And one of the challenges in innovation is finding that insight space. So don't stare at the data you have and your consumer reports. Go out and explore and be consumers or find consumers and find weird experiences. I remember we were doing some work with Gillette about their razor blades, and we went to interview petty thieves about why they stole razor blades in supermarkets. And we got some interesting insight about the product and how it worked. So find weird and deep people, and you will get great insight. And finally, the last thought is make uncommon connections. At the start, we had a little, and I'm now nicely tying it all up again. At the start, we had a thing about stories. Innovations are stories of uncommon connections, that when someone tells you the story, you go, wow, why didn't I think of that? And right at the start, why Picasso? So Picasso had an uncommon connection, and he also had a bit of a slow hunch. Picasso was a successful artist in Paris during his blue period and his rose period, but he was feeling frustrated because his friend Matisse was clearly the leader of the arts movement in Paris, and he was envious. He wanted to be the successful artist. And one night he was around at Matisse's house, and Matisse happened to have picked up a curiosity sculpture in the Rue de Rennes. And it was a small African sculpture. And Picasso picked it up and looked at it, and he spent the entire evening talking about it and looking at it. And then the next day, and over the next weeks, he thought there's something about this. And he ended up going to the Trocadero, which he hated. There were African masks and African sculptures there. And he knew something was happening, and he stared at them. He spent all day looking at these things. And out of that, he went back and started to paint Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which was his great piece of work which set off the Cubist movement. And that was his moment of a really uncommon connection. I'm trying to find a new way of expressing art, and I've been inspired by this weird curiosity that my friend Matisse, who I'm also massively envious of, has brought me. And that triggered off a whole evolution of art and where modern art came from. Google's story is the story of Larry Page on Alta Vista, and some of you may remember Alta Vista. It was a web portal. You may remember web portals. It was a web portal, and he was on it, and he was doing some research on data libraries. And he was looking at it, and they had a thing called reverse links. And he was like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what that is. And reverse links were the pages you'd come from to get where you are. And he idly thought about that. And at some point, he kind of thought, oh, that's a bit like Nobel Prize winners. Nobel Prize winners actually get selected, or the Nobel Prize people in the shortlist get selected by their citations of their work in other people's work, in other famous people's work, and recognized people's work. And that made me thought, wait a minute, that could be some kind of search tool. Instead of just doing volume thing, if I do something about the quality of the connections between the thing I'm looking for and someone else's website and the quality of that website, that will give me a search tool. And that was his moment of insight, connecting reverse links and Nobel Prize winners to go, there's something really interesting happening in this space. So that would be my final thought. Think about the rivers of thinking that maybe you're in and your colleagues are in. Think about slow hunching, and think about where you get the insight and how you push for connections to happen in the insight, and how you create stories. So right back at the start, it's actually what we're good at as humans we're really good storytellers. We're really bad at looking at data, and that's all that big data stuff. We just don't get it. But give us 3 bits of information, and we'll tell you what's going on. And that's kind of how we got out of the savannah in Africa all those tens of thousands of years ago. We're great at pattern recognition. So take advantage of it, but explore it at the edges. So that's my quick roundup. Thoughts on disruptive innovation. Thanks very much.
Very nice, Tony.